I am Chief Petty Officer Mark Ellison, and I was one of the men from SEAL Team 6 who went into the compound in Abbottabad on the night of May 2nd, 2011, and what I am about to describe has stayed with me for more than a decade and still follows me into quiet moments when the world slows down and memory has space to breathe, and some of what I carry has since been labeled declassified, while most of it has been buried so deep that no official record will ever admit it existed, and maybe that is because no one ever wanted to acknowledge it in the first place, because the truth behind it opens questions that do not fit inside the clean edges of the official narrative, which says that 23 SEALs flew into Pakistan on 2 modified Black Hawk helicopters, that 1 aircraft went down inside the compound due to unexpected air turbulence from the high perimeter walls, that we adapted, completed the mission, secured intelligence, and exfiltrated before Pakistani forces could respond. And that story is accurate as far as it goes, but it stops exactly where the uncomfortable part begins, because it never talks about what happened in the last 15 minutes inside the compound during the exploitation phase, when my fire team was ordered to clear and secure a second-floor room that, according to all pre-mission intelligence, was never supposed to exist at all. And by the time we reached that point, the mission had already started to unravel in ways none of us had trained for, because when Chalk 1 clipped the compound wall and slammed into the courtyard, every man on board knew immediately that the element of surprise was gone, and as Chalk 2 descended outside the walls where I was riding, I could hear the dying scream of Chalk 1's rotors echoing through the night, a high, thin sound that cut through bone and told you something expensive and irreplaceable had just been broken, and Lieutenant Commander Nathan Brooks hit the ground first, followed by me, then Senior Chief Daniel Rowe, and the rest of our element, and Brooks whispered, "Move, move, move," in comms, even though we all knew whispers no longer mattered, because half the city had probably heard the crash, and we breached the outer wall with precision charges and flowed inside exactly as rehearsed. But almost immediately something felt off, because the courtyard did not match the mock-ups we had studied for weeks, since intelligence showed bare ground on the western side, yet what we found was a carefully maintained garden filled with plants that did not belong in that climate, and under night vision, they moved in ways that did not match the direction of the rotor wash, and Rowe muttered that the vegetation was wrong, and he was right, but we did not stop to analyze it, because somewhere inside that structure was the most wanted man on Earth, and every second increased the chance of a Pakistani military response, and the assault element had already cleared the ground floor when we entered, with 3 adult males down and non-combatants secured, and everything looked clean on paper, except for the silence which pressed down on us the moment we crossed the threshold, because I had been in enough combat to know that even in controlled chaos, buildings breathe with sound, voices, movement, generators, dogs, radios, footsteps. But inside that compound, the outside world faded as if muffled by deep water, and even the helicopter noise dissolved into a distant hum. And when Brooks called for a comms check, our voices came back flat and hollow, as if swallowed by padded walls. And then the order came that the target was down and to begin exploitation, and those words should have carried relief or triumph, but instead they carried weight, and my team was tasked with securing materials from a second-floor western room that intelligence identified as Bin Laden's workspace. So we moved upstairs, with Rowe on point, me covering, and Brooks behind us, and the concrete stairs felt unnaturally cold through my gloves, and the walls were draped with fabric hangings marked by geometric designs that seemed to pulse under night vision in time with my heartbeat, and the second-floor hallway was narrow, with 4 doors, 2 on each side, and 3 were already marked cleared with chem lights, while the final door at the end had no marking, and Brooks said that was ours. And we stacked up and breached, even though the room had supposedly been cleared already, because complacency kills more operators than bullets. And when the door opened, what lay beyond was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with immediate threat, because the dimensions did not align with the building footprint. I knew by heart, since I had studied it for weeks, and the western wall should have been about 30 feet from the hallway. But this room stretched back at least twice that distance, with a ceiling higher than physics allowed, and it felt like stepping into a space that did not belong inside the structure we had entered. And Brooks confirmed the room was empty and ordered documentation. So we moved in professionally and spread sectors, and while no people were present, the room was filled with filing cabinets, 7 of them old metal units coated in dust far thicker than made sense in an occupied house, and a heavy wooden desk sat at the center, weighed down by loose papers held in place not by weights but by smooth stones, river-worn stones that did not belong on a second floor in Pakistan, and there were 7 of them, and Brooks ordered me to start photographing while Roe checked cabinets. And he reminded us to document everything before touching it because context matters, and as I photographed the desk, I saw handwritten Arabic correspondence laid out carefully alongside abstract sketches of spirals and angles that hurt the eyes if stared at too long, and Roe called out that the cabinets were unlocked, which immediately set alarms in my head because nothing important is left unsecured by a man that paranoid, and the labels on the folders were typed in English, which made no sense at all, and Brooks examined them, and the dates went back decades to times before Al-Qaeda existed, and Roe pulled a file marked Kabul, 1989, and inside were black and white photos of Soviet soldiers arranged in geometric formations around excavation sites, and the same patterns repeated again and again, and Brooks ordered everything bagged, and as we worked, the smell began to seep in, sweet, organic, and wrong like dead flowers, preserved too long, and Roe said it reminded him of the garden outside. Only stronger, and Brooks urged us to focus because we were running out of time, and that was when I noticed the next cabinet held folders labeled with Western names like Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, and others I recognized from history, and Brooks ordered us to bag everything without reading because his voice carried something close to fear, and as we emptied cabinet after cabinet, we reached the final drawer, which resisted, then opened with a sound like breath being drawn, and inside was a single thick file labeled Continuation, and despite Brooks ordering it sealed, Roe opened it to reveal glossy, modern photographs taken from impossible altitude showing American landmarks annotated in handwriting with future dates that had not yet happened, and Brooks ordered it sealed separately. And when I returned to the desk, I noticed the stones formed a deliberate pattern, an irregular heptagon carved with symbols, and beneath them lay an old torn document in English that read: the continuation requires observation, the observation requires sentence, the silence requires, and then ended violently, ripped away. And when Brooks ordered us to move, I replaced the stones exactly as found and caught a reflection in the warped window glass showing a tall, thin shape standing behind me, too tall and too still to be human. And when I spun, nothing was there, and Roe said the place was getting to us, and additional operators helped us carry 6 heavy document bags out, and before leaving, Roe noticed stones had shifted into a perfect circle without anyone touching them, and Brooks cut him off and ordered immediate exfiltration, and as we exited the compound and the downed helicopter was destroyed with thermite and white phosphorus, I looked back and saw movement in that second floor window, distorted figure watching, and as we lifted off in the Chinook, I saw the garden below arranged in the same pattern as the stones and the same pattern carved beneath the paint inside that impossible room. And as we flew toward Afghanistan with the document bags between us, Roe asked what I thought was in those files, and I told him nothing good, and the sound of the engines grounded me back into the physical world. But that room felt older than the rest of the building, and even then I knew we had stepped into something that did not belong to our war and would not stay buried forever. We touched down at Jalalabad airfield a little after 3 in the morning local time after a flight that felt longer than it was because no one spoke, and the vibration of the Chinook filled every gap where words might have tried to form, and when the rear ramp dropped and the hot Afghan air rushed and I felt a physical shift inside my chest, the way you do when you know you are back on friendly ground, but not truly safe because whatever we had carried out of that compound had not stayed behind in Pakistan. And as we disembarked with the document bags first, then the team, then the remains of target, I noticed immediately that security was heavier than usual with personnel. I did not recognize Delta operators, Marine sentries, and men in civilian suits, standing on a forward operating base at that hour, which alone should have been a warning sign, because civilians do not appear in the middle of the night unless something has already gone far beyond standard procedure. And one of the men in a suit stepped forward, introduced himself without really introducing himself, and congratulated us on mission success, and said they would be taking custody of the materials from here, and Brooke hesitated just long enough for me to notice before objecting on procedural grounds, only to be cut off with a calm final tone that told us the decision had already been made at a level none of us could touch. And when the man turned his eyes on me and addressed me by name, even though I was wearing sterile kit with no identifying markers, my stomach tightened because that meant someone had been watching us far closer than I was comfortable with. And when he asked for my camera, Brooks gave me the slightest nod, and I handed it over, knowing instinctively that whatever images were on it would never pass through normal intelligence channels. And as the men took the bags and vanished into the darkness without vehicles or escorts, Rowe muttered that it was strange, and Brooks told us to forget it and maintain compartmentalization. But his voice carried the strain of a man who knew that forgetting was not an option, and the official debrief later that morning reduced the entire operation to timelines, positions, and sanitized language. And when I tried to describe the room, the size discrepancy, the English-labeled files, the photographs with future dates, the debriefer redirected me smoothly again and again until it became clear that those details were not welcome. And after hours of questioning, Rowe and I compared notes outside and agreed they did not want to hear about the room at all. And Brooks later pulled us aside and told us plainly that the official record would show only standard materials recovered, and that anything else did not exist and was compartmented above all of us. And while he insisted he was not ordering us to lie, the effect was the same, because what we had seen was being erased before our eyes. And in the months that followed, the raid life moved forward with ceremony, briefings, and a narrative that painted the mission as clean and complete. But 6 months later, Rowe told me there was no record of my camera ever being confiscated or replaced, and that absence felt deliberate. And about a year after the raid, Brooks admitted quietly that the files we secured did not exist in any database he could access, and that architectural surveys of the compound showed the room as a normal size, which meant either someone was lying or reality itself had bent for a short time and then corrected itself. And Brooks spoke about sacred geometry and spaces built to exist outside normal physical rules, and the word continuation hung between us like a question without an answer. And as time passed, I began to notice patterns, events small enough to escape headlines, but precise enough to chill me, because dates I remembered from those photographs began to occur exactly at annotated warehouse fires, power outages, minor accidents, all lining up with impossible accuracy. And by 2017, 12 of the 16 dates had passed, and each one matched an event. And when Rowe called me about an embassy incident in Caracas on a date I knew too well, the weight of coincidence collapsed under the strain of repetition, and we both understood that someone had known the future in advance, and that knowledge had been stored in that room. And we debated reporting it, only to realize there was nowhere to report something that officially did not exist. And years later, after I had retired and moved into civilian life, 2 men from the Department of Defense Office of Special Investigations knocked on my door and asked me questions, not to accuse but to confirm that I knew what the correct answers were. And when they asked if I had noticed anything unusual since the raid, dreams, compulsions, feelings of being watched, I lied and said no, and they accepted the lie because it was the expected response, and left me with a card bearing only a phone number and the word continuity. And that number has lived in my wallet ever since. And when the final date passed in August 2024, matching a minor incident at a Nevada research facility, exactly as predicted 13 years earlier, I knew without doubt that what we found in Abbottabad was not about one man or one war, but about something that observed, recorded, and continued patiently across time and scale. And as I look back now, I understand that the raid may have been less about killing a target and more about creating access to that room and those files, and whatever intelligence could not be allowed to remain hidden forever. And the most terrifying realization is that we only took samples. Whatever remained may still be out there waiting to be found again, or waiting to find us. After the last predicted date passed and the quiet confirmation settled in that the events matched with exact precision, my life began to narrow in ways I did not recognize at first, because nothing dramatic happened on the surface, and there were no explosions or warnings or dramatic confrontations, but instead a slow tightening, as if invisible hands were drawing a cord around everything familiar. And I found myself replaying the moments in that room over and over, not as memories but as sensations: the smell, the silence, the feeling of standing inside a space that did not behave like the rest of the world. And I tried to bury it the way operators are trained to bury things, by focusing on routine work, gym sessions, range days, and later civilian security contracts. But the room kept returning in fragments, especially at night, when the mind has fewer defenses and sleep became shallow and broken. And the dreams always began the same way, with me climbing those concrete stairs again, feeling the unnatural cold through my gloves, seeing the fabric hangings breathe under night vision. And then the room would stretch farther than before, expanding until the walls disappeared, and the symbols beneath. The paint glowed faintly as if responding to my presence, and the tall, thin figure would stand at the edge of my vision, never moving, never approaching, just watching with a patience that felt older than fear. And I would wake with my heart pounding and my hands reaching instinctively for gear that was no longer there. And in daylight I told myself these were standard post-com, that symptoms that every operator carries some version of them, and that I was not special, and that nothing supernatural had occurred. But the problem with that explanation was that it did not account for the accuracy of those dates or the fact that I was not the only one seeing patterns. And when Roe called more frequently, we spoke carefully, never saying too much, but always circling the same unspoken understanding that something had been set in motion long before we arrived in Abbottabad, and that our presence there had only brushed against it like a hand across a surface that continued vibrating long after contact ended. And Brooks checked in occasionally, always measured, always guarded, and he admitted once that he had been warned not to pursue certain lines of inquiry, and that the warning had not come with threats, but with implications, which was worse because it meant compliance was expected, not enforced. And the world moved on with speeches, anniversaries, and documentaries that froze the raid into a clean, heroic snapshot, while everything that did not fit was shaved away. And when the compound was demolished and official surveys declared the room normal-sized, I felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. Relief that the physical evidence had been erased, and dread that it could be erased so completely. And when I tried to explain this to myself logically, I considered stress, memory distortion, and group reinforcement, but those explanations collapsed when I remembered the feel of the stones beneath my fingers, and the way they had rearranged themselves without sound or motion. And years later, when I left the teams and tried to build a civilian life, the distance did not help, because civilian time flows differently, slower and less structured, which leaves more space for thought. And I moved to Southern California, took private security work, and tried to anchor myself in ordinary things like traffic, weather, and baseball schedules. But the knock on my door in May 2015 cut through that illusion immediately, because the men who stood there carried themselves with the quiet confidence of people who know exactly how much authority they have and do not need to advertise it. And they asked about Neptune Spear, not to learn anything new, but to verify that I understood what I was allowed to acknowledge. And when they asked about unusual experiences since the raid, I knew they were not fishing randomly, and that someone somewhere had noticed the same patterns I had and was checking on the variables. And when they left the card with the phone number and the word continuity, I felt something settle into place, because continuation had been the label on that file, and continuity suggested not an endpoint but an unbroken line. And I understood then that whatever had been documented in that room was not a plan that ended, but a process that required monitoring and observers, and that observation itself might be part of the mechanism. And from that moment on, I became more careful, not paranoid, but deliberate about what I read, what I tracked, and what I allowed myself to notice. And yet, even with that discipline, the patterns continue to surface, not always dramatic, sometimes trivial. A power fluctuation, a localized fire, a data breach resolved quietly, each one aligning with a date that had been written years before. And I began to wonder if the events themselves were the point, or if they were markers, proof that the system was still functioning, and that someone or something was still paying attention. And this led me down quiet paths of research late at night into esoteric architecture, ancient mathematics, and the idea that certain geometries could influence perception and space, and that some cultures believed information could be stored not just in symbols or language, in spatial relationships themselves. And when I read about temples designed to create altered states through proportion and alignment, I thought of that room and the way it felt insulated from the rest of the compound, and I wondered if the symbols carved beneath the paint were not decorative, functional, if they served to separate that space from normal causality, and if the garden outside mirrored the same pattern as a larger anchor tying the room to the physical world. And these thoughts were unsettling because they suggested intent and resources beyond any terrorist organization. and pointed instead towards something older, more patient, and more systematic. And I considered the possibility that bin Laden had not been the architect of that room, but merely its caretaker or tenant. And that frightened me more than any enemy I had faced, because it implied layers of activity operating beneath the surface of history. And when I spoke to Roe about this, he was quiet for a long time before saying that whatever it was, it had noticed us, and that maybe the reason we were still alive and unbothered was because we had not interfered beyond taking samples. And that idea followed me because it reframed the raid not as an intrusion, but as an observation point in a much longer sequence, and I began to suspect that the real danger was not what we had seen, but what we might see if we kept looking. And yet, despite that caution, I could not stop thinking about the missing half of that torn document. The sentence that ended abruptly after silence requires, and I wondered what word followed, whether it was listening, witnessing, sacrifice, or something else entirely. And the uncertainty gnawed at me, because incomplete information is worse than bad information. And as the years passed and dates ran out, I felt a strange sense of anticipation rather than relief, because if the file had been tracking a finite set of events, then what came after? And did the absence of future dates mean the observation phase was complete, or that it had simply moved beyond our view? And on nights when dreams returned and the walls closed in, I would wake reaching for my wallet, feeling the edge of that card, and wondering if calling the number would answer anything or only confirm that I was still part of something I had never agreed to join. And I began to understand that the most powerful effect of that room was not fear but awareness, because once you see a crack in the structure of reality, you cannot unsee it, and everything afterward carries the knowledge that the rules may not be as fixed as you were taught, and that somewhere beyond the reach of official narratives, the continuation continues patiently and quietly, waiting for the next observer to step inside. Time did not soften the memory of that room, and instead it sharpened it, because distance gave me perspective, and perspective made the details heavier. And as years passed, I began to realize that the most dangerous thing we carried out of Abbottabad was not the documents or the photographs, or even the knowledge that future events could be predicted, but the awareness that the structure of reality itself could be shaped and bent. And that awareness changed the way I saw everything that followed, because once you understand that space can lie, then certainty becomes fragile. And I carried the fragility into civilian life, where I tried to build routines that felt solid, like regular workouts, scheduled shifts, and predictable drives along the coast. But no matter how normal things appeared, there was always a thin layer of unease beneath them, as if the world I was moving through was only one version layered over others. And sometimes that feeling intensified without warning, like walking into a room and forgetting why you entered it except magnified. And when that happened, I would find myself thinking back to the garden outside the compound and the way the plants seemed arranged with purpose. And I began to suspect that the room was only one node in a larger structure, and that structure might not even be fixed to one location, but rather replicated wherever the pattern could be established. And this idea followed me into my research, because I started noticing how often similar shapes appeared in architecture, both ancient and modern, and how frequently certain proportions repeated across cultures that never interacted. And I told myself this was pattern seeking, a natural human impulse, especially in people trained to identify threats. But the difference here was that patterns were not abstract, they were functional, because they aligned with events in the real world. And the more I thought about it, the more I suspected that the dates in that continuation file were not predictions, but observations written from a vantage point that existed outside the linear flow of time. And that idea frightened me more than the possibility of advanced intelligence gathering, because it implied a perspective that was not bound by cause and effect. And when I shared this with Roe during one of our guarded conversations, he did not dismiss it, and instead said that the room had felt like a place where things were stored that did not belong anywhere else. And that statement stayed with me, because it framed the room not as an active weapon, but as a repository, and repositories exist to preserve things over long durations. And that raised the question of who built it and why and when. And the more I considered those questions, the less sense it made that any modern group could have created it from scratch, because the craftsmanship and materials felt older and more deliberate. And I began to think that bin Laden had inherited the space rather than constructed it. and that his role may have been to protect or utilize it rather than understand it fully, and that possibility reframed his isolation and paranoia not as fear of drones or raids, but as fear of losing control of something he did not entirely comprehend. And when Pakistani authorities demolished the compound, I wondered who oversaw that process and whether anything was removed quietly beforehand, because demolition is a convenient way to erase evidence, and yet erasure does not destroy knowledge, it only relocates it. And as I followed global news in the years that followed, I noticed subtle shifts, not dramatic changes, but an increase in events that were resolved quickly and quietly with minimal coverage. And I wondered how many of those aligned with other dates we never saw, and how many continuation files existed beyond the one we touched, and whether each one represented a different thread being monitored and maintained. And these thoughts deepened my sense of isolation, because there was no safe place to discuss them and no official channel that would not trigger unwanted attention. And the visit from the agents confirmed that monitoring extended to us as well, and that awareness altered my behavior in small ways, like choosing words more carefully and avoiding certain topics entirely. And while I never felt overtly threatened, I understood that my continued freedom was conditional on my silence, and that silence became another weight to carry because it meant accepting that some truths are deliberately suppressed not to protect people from panic, but to protect systems from scrutiny. And when I thought about Brooks and the way he had aged after the raid, I realized that leadership in that moment had required him to shoulder a burden he could never share fully, and I respected him more for it because he chose to shield his team rather than pursue answers that might have destroyed careers or worse. And as time went on, I became increasingly convinced that the continuation was not finished, and that the absence of future dates might indicate a transition rather than an end, and that perhaps observation had moved into a different phase, one that required less documentation and more subtlety. And this idea found its way into my dreams, where the room would appear again, but empty of cabinets and stones, with only the symbols remaining glowing faintly as if awaiting inscriptions. And in those dreams, the tall, thin figure would no longer stand at a distance, but would blend into the walls, becoming part of the pattern itself. And when I woke from those dreams, I would feel a sense of being evaluated rather than hunted, as if my reactions were data points, and my restraint was being measured. And this interpretation troubled me because it suggested agency and intention beyond anything human, and I began to consider that the continuation might not belong to any government or organization, but to a process that predates them all, and that governments merely discovered fragments of it and attempted to harness or contain them. And if that were true, then the raid was not the beginning or the end of anything, but simply a moment where different layers of activity intersected briefly. And I started to see historical events through that lens, wondering how many turning points had been nudged by similar mechanisms, and how often humans mistook coincidence for randomness, when in fact they were observing outcomes shaped by unseen structures. And this line of thought was dangerous because it eroded the sense of free will that most people rely on to function, and I forced myself to step back, reminding myself that speculation without evidence leads nowhere. But the problem was that I had evidence, even if it was unofficial and suppressed, and that evidence had been enough to alter my internal map of the world. And once that map changes, you cannot revert to the old one. And the more I tried to live normally, the more I realized that normality itself is a fragile agreement maintained by shared ignorance, and that ignorance had been stripped from me inside that room and replaced with questions that had no safe answers. And I wondered if the other operators who entered that room carried similar burdens, and how many of them had chosen denial as a coping mechanism, and how many lay awake at night replaying the same moments. And I thought about the agents who visited me, and the way they framed their questions not to gather information, but to ensure stability and continuity. And that word took on new meaning because continuity implies preservation of state and avoidance of disruption. And perhaps that was the true purpose of the system, to maintain a certain trajectory while smoothing out deviations. And if that were the case, then the predicted events might not have been warnings of disaster, but corrections ensuring that larger patterns remained intact. And that realization chilled me because it suggested that human suffering could be reduced to maintenance noise in a process too vast to care about individual lives. And yet, despite these thoughts, I found a strange comfort in the idea that the world was not entirely chaotic, because chaos at least implies randomness, while this implied order, however, alien. And as I wrestled with these ideas, I came to understand that the real horror of what we found was not supernatural or monstrous. Existential, because it challenged the assumption that humanity is the primary author of its own history. And that challenge is difficult to confront because it forces you to question where responsibility truly lies and whether resistance is even possible. And I realized then that the silence described in that torn document was not absence of sound but absence of interference, and that silence might be a requirement for observation to function. And if so, then speaking too loudly or too openly about the continuation might itself be a form of disruption, and perhaps that was why everything around it was buried under layers of classification and denial, because quiet allows systems to persist unnoticed, and once noticed they risk alteration. And as these thoughts settled into me, I understood that my role was not to expose or fight this system, but to survive with the knowledge of it, and to decide how much of myself I was willing to surrender to the weight of understanding. And that decision remains unresolved, because every time I think I have accepted it, another detail surfaces, another memory sharpens, and the room feels closer than ever, as if distance in years means nothing to a structure that exists outside time. And I am left with the unsettling sense that observation is not a one-way process, and that somewhere the continuation is aware of those who became aware of it, and that awareness may be the final threshold none of us truly crossed that night, but all of us brushed against without realizing how deep it went. The realization that settled over me in the years after the raid was not sudden but gradual, like pressure building deep underwater, and it became clear that the continuation was not simply a record of events, but a process that interacted with those who became aware of it, and that awareness itself carried consequences. And once I understood that, I began to reinterpret everything that had happened since Abbottabad not as isolated incidents, but as responses and adjustments. And I thought often about the men who had come to my house, and the way they asked about dreams and compulsions, because that suggested they were tracking not just information leaks, but cognitive effects. And that raised the unsettling possibility that exposure to the room altered perception in measurable ways. And if that was true, then our presence there may have marked us as variables in a system that prefers stability. And that idea explained the subtlety of the monitoring, because overt pressure would create disturbance, while quiet observation would preserve continuity. And I began to think of the continuation as less of a project and more of an ecosystem that maintained balance through observation and correction. And when deviations occurred, they were noted and addressed through small, precise interventions rather than dramatic resets. And this framework helped me make sense of the predicted events, because none of them were world-changing catastrophes, but each one nudged systems back toward equilibrium. And the fact that they were recorded years in advance suggested a model that could simulate outcomes with extraordinary fidelity. And as I considered this, I realized that such a model would require data beyond anything humans currently acknowledge, and that brought me back to the symbols carved beneath the paint and the way they repeated at different scales, because fractal structures allow information to be encoded efficiently and redundantly. And perhaps those symbols were not decorative or mystical, but mathematical representations of relationships too complex to express linearly. And if so, then the room itself was not just a container, but a processor, a place where information could be stored and interpreted simultaneously, and that interpretation might generate the dates and annotations we saw. And when I imagined that process, I felt a cold clarity, because it meant that the room was active, even when unoccupied, and that its function did not require a caretaker to operate, only someone to maintain its physical integrity and shield it from disruption. And that role could have been filled by anyone who understood enough to stay out of its way. And I began to suspect that bin Laden had been selected not for his ideology but for his isolation, because his compound provided cover and his presence discouraged scrutiny from other actors, and his death may have been anticipated within the continuation because it created a window for extraction and redistribution of material. And if that was the case, then our raid was not an anomaly but a scheduled event in a much longer sequence. And that possibility unsettled me, because it stripped the operation of its sense of agency and reframed it as a component in a system that anticipated and accommodated our actions. And when I tried to reject this interpretation as paranoia, I returned to the evidence of the dates and the accuracy with which they matched events, and the rearrangement of the stones which demonstrated responsiveness and adaptation, and the reflection of the tall, thin figure which suggested observation and presence, and none of those elements fit within a model of passive archives or coincidence. And as I thought about this, I began to notice subtle changes in my own behavior, not because I was compelled, but because my perception had shifted, and I found myself paying attention to timing patterns and environmental cues in ways that felt automatic and efficient, as if some part of my mind had recalibrated to recognize rhythms I had previously ignored. And this worried me because it suggested influence and adaptation rather than mere knowledge, and I tested myself by deliberately ignoring certain patterns to see if discomfort would arise, and sometimes it did, as a faint unease that dissipated when I re-engaged, and this led me to wonder whether awareness itself was being reinforced because observers provide feedback and feedback stabilizes systems, and if that were true, then calling the number on the card might serve to reintegrate observers who were drifting too far from the expected range, and that interpretation made the card feel less like an emergency contact and more like a calibration tool, and I kept it nonetheless because not knowing felt worse than knowing it existed, and I thought often about Ross and Brooks and the others who had entered that room, and whether they experienced similar shifts, and whether they had received visits of their own, and we never discussed it directly because we understood that some conversations are themselves disruptive, and silence can be protective and yet silent also isolates, and that isolation was one of the hardest parts because it meant carrying questions without community and accepting that some truths are not meant to be shared widely, not because they are dangerous in a violent sense, but because they undermine foundational assumptions, and those assumptions are necessary for societies to function. And when I framed it that way, I could almost understand the rationale behind the suppression, because mass awareness of systems that predict and correct events would erode accountability and agency, and could lead to paralysis or fatalism, and perhaps the continuation existed precisely to avoid such destabilization by keeping its influence subtle and its visibility minimal, and this line of reasoning did not comfort me. But it provided a context that made the actions of those monitoring us feel less malicious and more procedural, and that distinction mattered because it allowed me to function without constant fear, and yet despite that rationalization the dreams persisted, and sometimes they changed because instead of the room expanding it would contract until the walls pressed close, and the symbols would fade leaving only blank surfaces, and the tall thin figure would step closer, and in those moments I felt not threatened but assessed. And the sensation was like standing before an instructor who knows exactly what you are capable of, and is deciding whether you meet a threshold, and I would wake from those dreams with a sense of having passed or failed some unspoken metric, and that ambiguity gnawed at me because without feedback there is no learning, and without learning there is only repetition, and I wondered if the continuation relied on human observers precisely because we seek meaning and patterns, and that our interpretations fed back into the system providing context that raw data could not supply, and if that were the case, then our presence in the room had initiated a feedback loop that would persist as long as we remained alive and attentive, and that possibility reframed my responsibility because it meant that my choices mattered not in a heroic sense but in a subtle stabilizing way, and that realization pushed me toward restraint because excessive attention could distort signals while measured observation could maintain balance, and this mindset influenced how I lived because I avoided extremes, avoided public speculation, avoided drawing attention to anomalies, and focused instead on maintaining a low noise profile, and over time this became habit. And the unease receded to a manageable background hum, and yet every anniversary of the raid brought the memories back into sharp focus, and I would replay those final moments in the room, especially the instant when the stones rearranged, because that was the clearest demonstration of responsiveness, and I realized then that the continuation did not require belief or fear to operate, only interaction, and that interaction had occurred whether we acknowledged it or not. And as I considered the long arc of history, I wondered how many such systems existed, and how many times humans had brushed against them, and misinterpreted the encounter as divine or mystical or random, and whether modern classification and bureaucracy were simply new layers of myth designed to manage contact in a secular age, and that thought lingered because it suggested that the true continuity across eras was not knowledge itself, but the methods used to conceal and contextualize it. And as I write this, I understand that my role is not to resolve these questions, but to record my experience faithfully, because documentation itself is a form of observation. And perhaps by sharing this, I am adding another layer to the continuation, one that exists outside official channels and inside human memory, and that act carries risk because awareness can spread, but it also carries value because silence without record becomes erasure, and erasure invites repetition without learning. And if the continuation truly values stability, then honest reflection may serve it better than denial. And yet, even as I hold that thought, I remain cautious, because systems that operate quietly often do so for reasons beyond our comprehension, and I have no desire to become a disruptive variable, and so I balance on that line between witness and participant, aware that the line itself may be the point, and that as long as I remain conscious of it, I am fulfilling whatever role was assigned to me the moment I stepped into that impossible room and felt the world subtly shift around me. As the years continued to pass, the weight of what we encountered did not fade, but instead settled into a deeper layer of understanding, and I came to realize that the greatest danger was not exposure or retaliation, but complacency, because the longer I lived with the knowledge, the easier it would have been to normalize it, and normalization would have been a kind of surrender, and I resisted that by reminding myself regularly of how wrong that room felt, and how instinct alone had told me it violated something fundamental, and I returned often to the memory of the silence, because it was not merely the absence of sound but the presence of restraint, as if the room itself was holding its breath. And that detail mattered because silence can be imposed or chosen, and this silence felt intentional and designed, and over time I understood that the silence was part of the mechanism, because observation requires stillness, and interference introduces noise, and noise disrupts patterns, and the continuation appeared to be built around minimizing noise while maximizing clarity. And that principle echoed in the way information had been compartmented after the raid, and in the way we were quietly monitored rather than confronted, and in the way predicted events occurred without spectacle, and were allowed to pass unnoticed by most of the world. And as I connected these elements, I began to see the continuation not as something hostile, but as something indifferent, and indifference can be more frightening than malice because it does not negotiate or explain, and it does not care about intention, only outcome. And this realization changed the way I thought about responsibility, because if the system does not care why events occur, only that they align, then morality becomes a human overlay rather than a governing principle, and that thought unsettled me because it implied that ethical frameworks are local and contingent, while the continuation operates on a scale where such distinctions blur, and yet despite that scale, it still interacted with human observers, which suggested that we provided something it could not generate on its own, and that something might be interpretation or contextual judgment, or perhaps simply the act of noticing and recording. And I thought about the word sentence in that torn document, because sentence can mean language or judgment or confinement. Each interpretation carried implications, and I wondered if the missing portion described a requirement for articulation or acknowledgement, and whether the act of observation alone was insufficient without expression. And that idea led me to reconsider my silence, because while silence preserves stability, it also prevents integration, and unresolved systems tend to accumulate pressure and eventually release it unpredictably. And if the continuation truly spanned decades or centuries, then it must have mechanisms for adaptation, and perhaps human testimony was one such mechanism operating outside official structures. And this possibility troubled me, because it suggested that my eventual decision to speak was not rebellion, but participation. And that reframed the risk, because participation implies acceptance of role. And once you accept a role, you become accountable to the system that assigned it, and I questioned whether I wanted that accountability, and yet the alternative was to carry the knowledge alone until it hollowed me out. And I saw glimpses of that fate in Brooks, who carried himself with the stoic discipline of an officer, but whose eyes held a fatigue that no amount of Rest could erase, and I suspected that he had been exposed to more than we were told, and that he had chosen containment over inquiry to protect those under him, and I respected that choice, but I also recognized its cost because containment without release becomes corrosion, and I wondered how many people in positions of authority had made similar choices over the years and how many had been slowly worn down by secrets they could not share, and this thought expanded outward to institutions themselves because organizations are collections of people. And if enough individuals carry unspoken burdens, those burdens shape policy and culture, and perhaps the continuation influenced history not by direct intervention, but by shaping the constraints within which decisions were made, and that influence would be subtle and persistent, and nearly impossible to detect without a reference point outside the system. And I realized that the room provided such a reference point because it existed outside normal parameters and allowed observers to glimpse the structure from a different angle, and that might be why access to it was so tightly controlled, and why its existence was erased, because such reference points destabilize narratives, and narratives are essential tools of governance and warfare. And I thought about how the war on terror had been framed as a series of discrete battles and objectives, when in reality it was a long, diffuse process shaped by intelligence flows. Perception management and the continuation might have been observing that process, not to direct it, but to record its evolution and identify inflection points. And if that were true, then the raid was a point as much as an operation, and our presence there added human variables to a dataset that extended far beyond us, and this interpretation did not absolve responsibility, but it contextualized it, and I found some measure of peace in that because it meant that my experience was not meaningless even if it was unsettling. And as I continued to reflect, I noticed that my dreams gradually shifted again, and the room no longer appeared hostile or evaluative but static, as if dormant, and in those dreams I was alone with the cabinets removed, and the walls bare except for faint impressions where symbols once were, and the silence was deeper and more neutral. And when I woke from those dreams, I felt a sense of closure that was incomplete but stabilizing, and I interpreted this as a sign that whatever phase we had intersected with was concluding or moving beyond our reach. And yet I remained cautious because systems that operate on long timescales do not end abruptly, and transitions can be subtle and extended. And I kept watching the news, not obsessively but attentively, and I noticed fewer alignments, fewer moments where dates snapped into focus. And this absence suggested either that the observation window had closed or that my access to it had diminished. And both possibilities carried relief and loss, because relief meant fewer sleepless nights, and loss meant the fading of clarity, and clarity, even when disturbing, has value. And I reflected on the idea that perhaps the continuation required renewal through periodic rediscovery, and that once exposed it must retreat or be dismantled, preserve its function, and the demolition of the compound could have been part of that reset. And if so, then future rooms might be built elsewhere using similar principles, waiting quietly until circumstances align again. And this cyclical pattern would align with how ancient knowledge often survived, through fragmentation and rediscovery rather than continuous transmission. And that thought reinforced my sense that what we encountered was not a singular anomaly, but part of a recurring phenomenon. And that understanding made me less inclined to see myself as uniquely burdened and more as one link in a long chain of witnesses stretching back beyond recorded history. And that perspective was humbling because it placed my experience within a continuum rather than at its center, and humility can be grounding when faced with incomprehensible systems. And yet, even with that grounding, the memory of the tall, thin figure remained unresolved because it represented agency and presence, and I could not fully integrate it into a model of passive observation. And I considered the possibility that it was a projection or artifact of stress, but the consistency of its appearance and the timing of its manifestations argued against that, and I wondered if it represented an interface rather than an entity, a visual shorthand for a process that cannot be perceived directly. And if so, then its appearance in reflection rather than directly might have been significant, because reflection implies mediation and distance, and perhaps direct perception was neither intended nor safe. And this interpretation reduced the fear associated with it, but increased the complexity because it suggested intentional design in how information and presence were revealed and concealed. And I accepted that I would never fully understand this, and that understanding might not even be desirable because complete comprehension could itself be destabilizing, and I came to believe that partial awareness coupled with restraint was the optimal state for human observers, and that belief aligned with how the system appeared to manage exposure by granting glimpses without full access, and then withdrawing. And as I integrated this belief into my life, the constant edge of unease softened, and I was able to engage more fully with the present moment, appreciating ordinary experiences without constantly scanning for hidden patterns. And that balance felt earned and fragile, and I guarded it carefully. And yet I also accepted that once you have crossed a threshold of awareness, you remain changed, and that change carries responsibility to remember and to choose deliberately rather than drift. And that is perhaps the most enduring impact of that room, because it forced me to confront the limits of certainty and the necessity of humility, and to recognize that some truths are not meant to be mastered but acknowledged and respected, and that respect includes knowing when to remain silent and when to speak. And as I approach the end of this account, I do so not to resolve the mystery, but to honor the experience and to place it into the human record where it belongs, because whatever the continuation is, it intersects with us through memory and testimony. And if those are erased, then only the system remains unchallenged and uncontextualized, and that outcome would represent a loss not just for individuals, but for humanity itself. And so I continue to hold the memory carefully, neither amplifying it nor denying it. And I remain attentive to the world around me, aware that beneath the surface of ordinary events, deeper structures may be at work, and that awareness shapes my choices in quiet ways. And I live with the understanding that observation is never neutral, and that to see is to participate, and that participation carries consequences even when those consequences are delayed or obscured. And this understanding is the final lesson that the room left me with, and it is one I carry forward with caution, respect, and a commitment to remain human within systems that may not share our values but nonetheless rely on us to function. I am telling this now not because I expect belief or validation, but because silence eventually becomes a form of distortion, and distortion is how meaning decays. And I have carried this long enough to know that memory unattended begins to fold in on itself and lose shape, and what we encountered that night deserves shape even if it never receives acknowledgement, and the official story will always remain that we executed a precision raid, eliminated a target, and recovered intelligence. And that version is not false, but it is incomplete, and incompleteness is where the real danger lies, because it creates the illusion of understanding without substance. And I have lived long enough with the deeper version to know that the truth does not demand acceptance, only recognition. And what I recognize now is that the room in Abbottabad was not an anomaly, but a threshold, and thresholds do not belong to those who cross them. They belong to what lies beyond, and we stepped across briefly without permission and without comprehension, and were allowed to leave with fragments. And that allowance itself was meaningful, because nothing prevents without reason, and nothing permits without purpose. And I no longer believe that the continuation was about predicting catastrophe or controlling outcomes in a simple sense, but about maintaining coherence across time, and coherence requires reference points, and reference points require observers, and we became observers the moment we noticed the room did not obey the rules we relied on, and from that moment forward we were no longer operating solely within the human frame of conflict and consequence, but within a larger context that does not align neatly with our moral narratives. And that realization was the most difficult to integrate, because it challenged the idea that courage and sacrifice always sit at the center of history, and instead suggested that history itself may be shaped by processes that treat those qualities as variables rather than virtues. And this does not make courage meaningless, but it does make it local and contingent, and that is a harder truth to carry, because it strips away the comfort of universal purpose and replaces it with situational relevance. And I struggled with that shift, because like many operators, I was raised on the belief that clarity of mission and righteousness of cause were anchors, and the room dissolved those anchors by revealing a deeper layer where missions intersect with systems that do not care about intent and only register effect. And once you see that layer, you cannot unsee it, and every subsequent action is taken with the awareness that its significance may not be what you think it is. And this awareness followed me into every decision, large and small, and forced me to confront the limits of agency and the reality of participation. And I came to understand that participation does not require consent, only presence, and we were present, and that presence mattered. And as years passed, And the final annotated date came and went with quiet precision. I felt neither relief nor fear, but a sober confirmation that what we saw was real and persistent, and not bound by our expectations. And the incident in Nevada was small and forgettable to most people, and that forgettability was point because the continuation did not announce itself and did not require recognition to function. And I thought back to the agents who visited me and the way they framed continuity not as a threat but as maintenance, and I realized then that their role was not to silence but to stabilize. And stabilization does not mean suppressing truth entirely but managing its exposure. And perhaps this account is part of that management, whether intended or not, because it frames the experience in human terms without claiming authority over it. And that balance feels important because unchecked revelation can be as destabilizing as unchecked secrecy. And somewhere between those extremes lies a narrow corridor where understanding can exist without collapse. And that corridor is where I have tried to stand. And as I reflect on the path that led me here, I recognize that my initial fear had transformed into something quieter and more complex, and fear thrives on the unknown while understanding thrives on context. And I have enough context now to know that the continuation is not malevolent, but it is also not benevolent, and it exists beyond those categories, and that neutrality is unsettling because it denies us the comfort of opposition and forces us to accept coexistence, and coexistence with something you cannot influence directly requires humility and restraint, and I have learned those lessons slowly through years of observation and reflection, and I no longer seek answers in the way I once did because seeking implies entitlement, and entitlement does not apply here, and instead I focus on maintaining clarity within my own experience and ensuring that I do not project meaning where there is none or deny meaning where it exists, and that discipline has allowed me to live a functional life despite carrying knowledge that does not integrate easily with everyday narratives. And I think often about the others who entered that room and how they have chosen to live with it, and whether they too have found a balance between silence and acknowledgement, and I suspect that each of us has resolved it differently because the continuation does not dictate personal response, only structural alignment. And that flexibility is another indicator that it is not a controlling force, but a monitoring one, and monitoring does not eliminate choice, it contextualizes it. And that distinction matters because it preserves the possibility of moral action even within larger systems, and I hold on to that possibility because without it everything collapses into determinism, and determinism is a dead end for human meaning, and I refuse to accept that end because even if the universe operates on principles beyond our comprehension, our experience within it still matters, and how we respond to awareness still defines us, and I choose to respond with honesty tempered by restraint and curiosity tempered by respect. And I recognize that this account may be dismissed as fabrication or psychological projection, and I accept that outcome because dismissal does not erase experience. It only relocates it into the margins where many important truths reside, and margins are where systems often reveal themselves most clearly because they are less defended and less curated, and perhaps that is why the continuation allowed fragments to escape, because fragments do not threaten stability, but they do invite contemplation, and contemplation is a human strength. And I take some comfort in the idea that even within vast impersonal systems, there is room for human reflection and interpretation, and that those qualities may be precisely what such systems lack and therefore require. And as I approach the end of this narrative, I return mentally to that second floor room, and I see it not as it was, but as it represented a place where human conflict intersected with something older and quieter and more patient, and that intersection left traces in all of us who passed through, and those traces persist not as scars, but as altered perception, and altered perception is not a curse if it is integrated responsibly, and I believe I have done that to the best of my ability, and I continue to live with the understanding that the world is layered, and that beneath the surface of what we call history, there are deeper currents shaping outcomes in subtle ways, and that awareness does not diminish my humanity, but expands it by forcing me to confront uncertainty without retreat and to accept complexity without surrender, and that acceptance is the final resolution I have reached, because resolution does not mean closure, but accommodation, and I have accommodated this experience into my life without allowing it to consume me. and that balance is hard-won and easily lost, and I maintain it. Through attention and humility, and by remembering that while we may not be the authors of every event, we are still responsible for how we bear witness to them, and bearing witness with integrity is the one action that remains entirely within our control, and so I offer this account not as a revelation but as testimony, and testimony does not demand belief, only acknowledgement that someone was there and saw something that did not fit and lived with that knowledge and chose not to erase it entirely. And if nothing else, this stands as proof that the continuation touched human lives and that those lives continued afterward altered but intact, and that may be the most human outcome possible when confronted with systems that transcend us. And as I move forward, I remain attentive to the world, not searching for patterns obsessively, but open to the possibility that they exist, and that awareness itself is a responsibility, and I carry that responsibility quietly, knowing that the silence still listens, and that somewhere beyond our perception, the continuation continues not as a threat, but as a reminder that reality is wider than our stories, and that within that width there is still room for choice, memory, and meaning, and that is enough. If this story stayed with you after the last word, then you already understand why I finally chose to tell it. And if you want to hear more accounts like this ones that live in the space between official history and the things no report ever admits, then stay here, subscribe, and keep listening, because some stories are not meant to end cleanly, and the continuation is never truly over.